side of that tonight. God cares for us. God cares enough for us to send His only Son to die in our place on the cross. But does man care? We're going to look tonight at the heavy cost of indifference. If you would please turn your Bibles over to Jeremiah 37. Jeremiah 37. Now, indifference can be a very bad thing. Can you imagine indifference when your nation is being invaded? And God's saying, do one thing, and everybody's indifferent. That kind of is shocking. But that's what's going on with what we're looking at right now. Jeremiah chapter 37. We are under Zedekiah's reign. We looked just briefly at that previously. But as we look at this, Zedekiah is the last king. And I'm going to say that loosely. We're going to look at a couple other things. Zedekiah is the last king here. Then they go into captivity. But he doesn't pay attention to what's going on and what he's being told by God, and he won't listen. So we start here in Jeremiah chapter 37. And King Zedekiah, the son of Josiah, reigned instead of Coniah, the son of Jehoiakim, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, made king in the land of Judah. But neither he, nor his servants, nor the people of the land did hearken unto the words of the Lord, which he spake by the prophet Jeremiah. And Zedekiah the king sent Jehudakal, the son of Shemaliah, Zephaniah, the son of Maaseiah, the priest, to the prophet Jeremiah, saying, Pray now unto the Lord our God for us. Now Jeremiah came in and went out among the people, for they had not put him in prison. We're going to look at that in a minute. Then Pharaoh's army was come forth out of Egypt. And when the Chaldeans that besieged Jerusalem heard tidings of them, they departed from Jerusalem. They come to ask him a question. But they come in indifference. They've been surrounded. Now Pharaoh's army comes up, and Nebuchadnezzar's army, the Babylonian army, leaves. And they become indifferent throughout all of this. We're going to look at that tonight, and hope it's a blessing to your heart. Let's go ahead and go before the Lord in prayer. Lord, I pray that you would just have your hand, and you would just have your working, and Lord, I pray you'd help us, Lord, in an indifferent world, Lord, to stand for you. And Lord, I pray you just have your hand and have your help and have your working. Lord, just deal in hearts in our nation. And we ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Son asked his dad, what's the difference between ignorance and indifference? And the dad responded back, don't know and don't care. They weren't ignorant. They'd heard what God had said, but they were indifferent. They didn't want to deal with what God had said and do what God had said. Jeremiah, anybody want to take a guess how long Jeremiah's been preaching by this point? 39 years. Most Bible commentators, most preachers, when they examine Jeremiah, look at it and say, as far as what we see in the biblical record, he didn't have one single convert. That's striking. Now, I kind of, there may have been ones we don't know about. I kind of count them in. We're going to look at later on. But nobody listened. For 39 years, nobody listened. That's got to be tough. That's got to be difficult. William Carey and Thomas, and also Thomas, were in India for 7 years laboring. For 7 years they labored, didn't see a single convert. And one man came to the medical mission named Krishna Pal. And Krishna Pal they talked with him about Christ and his need, and Krishna Pal would get saved, be a preacher for over 20 years in India. And Krishna Pal would write these words, and I think they're kind of poignant. Well, this is actually translated into English from there. O thou my soul, forget no more the friend who all thy sorrows bore. Let every idol be forgot, but O my soul, forget him not. The nation had forgotten God. They kind of served him, but along with him they served those idols. And they had forgotten who they were supposed to serve. Judson, in 12 years, had 18 converts. Sometimes things are harder than what they were. There's been times in American history where hearts have been hardened. There have been times where they've been softened. We're entering into a point where hearts had been hardened. And that's what was going on there for Jeremiah. When God had called Jeremiah back in the reign of Josiah, he said this in chapter 1, verse 17. Thou therefore gird up thy loins and arise, and speak unto them all that I command thee. Be not dismayed at their faces, lest I confound thee before them. God knew what was going to happen before it happened. For behold, I have made this day thee this day a defense city, and an iron pillar, and brazen walls against the whole land, against the kings of Judah, and against the princes thereof, against the priests thereof, and against the people of the land. And they shall fight against thee, but they shall not prevail against thee, for I am with thee, saith the Lord, to deliver thee. Well, what a blessing. They're not going to listen. I think that would be kind of discouraging to hear that, that God would say that just as God starts to call him, but God knows what was going to happen, and God saw that from the very beginning. So it's at this point where we see what's happening and what goes on in all of that. And here's the summary in chapter 37. This sums up most of what's happened. Verse 1, King Zedekiah, the son of Josiah, reigned instead of Coniah, the son of Jehoiakim, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, made king in the land of Judah. But neither he, nor his servants, nor the people of the land, did hearken unto the words of the Lord, which he spake by the prophet Jeremiah. Now understand, this is what they're saying. God sees their hearts. God sees what they say. Now, did they go into Jeremiah? Yeah. They went into Jeremiah, but they didn't hearken. They didn't listen. They were indifferent to what was said. And sometimes people, sometimes nations become indifferent. I shared this morning that just a huge population, looking at the millennial population to see about 45% don't know, don't care, or don't believe God exists. That's not talking about salvation. They just don't believe there is a God. That's striking. What do you do with that? Very much the same thing that happened in Russia. There was a movement against God, and they turned the children against the parents when the Russian Revolution came in. And that's what's going on here. We have a nation that's indifferent against God. In Isaiah chapter 1, clear back when God calls Isaiah in the reign of Hezekiah, years and years before this, the ox knoweth his owner, and the ass his mother's crib. But Israel doth not know, my people doth not consider. A sinful nation, a people laden with iniquity, a seed of evildoers, children of the corrupters. They have forsaken the Lord. They have provoked the Holy One of Israel into anger. They are gone away backwards. When it came to that point, they were just simply indifferent. The whole nation was indifferent. People can become indifferent. Churches can become indifferent. The church at Laodicea was indifferent. They were lukewarm. But all different ways things can become indifferent to God. Now there's one point that tends to maybe get people to a point where they're less indifferent to God, but they're indifferent in a different way. And that's when there is trouble. So what we see here, they are besieged, and they go to Jeremiah. Now eventually Egypt comes in, and the Chaldeans are scared off temporarily. But when problems come, sometimes that's when people care. When people only care when there is trouble, there's an issue. They're still indifferent, but they're indifferent in a different way. That even makes sense. Trouble comes. Look at verse 3. And Zedekiah, the king, sent Jehudakal, the son of Shemaiah, and Zephaniah, the son of Maasiel, I probably pronounced it in 2 different ways, the priest, to the prophet Jeremiah, saying, Pray now unto the Lord our God for us. They wanted prayer. Now, just as an observation, how many times when you talk to people or just they want the preacher to pray for what they want rather than do what God has said? It's very common in our society. You have people, they pray for this, pray for that. There's a whole, the name it, claim it community out there, just pray for what you want. Many times people want prayer, but they don't want what God has said. And that's a dangerous thing. They want prayer. Now, did they need prayer? Yes, they needed prayer, but they needed prayer to do what God had said to do. That they were to submit. They didn't want to do that. They didn't want to do this, what God had said. They wanted to do it their own way. Crisis often causes people to want to seek God temporarily. Nehemiah chapter 9 kind of spells it out. Nevertheless, they were disobedient and rebelled against thee, and cast thy law behind their backs, and slew thy prophets, which testified against them to turn them to thee, and they wrought great provocations. Now understand, this is probably part of what this time is. Nehemiah is looking back at this right now. Therefore thou deliverest them into their hand of their enemies, who vexed them in the time of their trouble. When they cried unto thee, thou heardest them from heaven, and according to their manifold mercies, thou gavest them saviors, who saved them out of the hand of their enemies. You look at the book of Judges, that's a good summary of the book of Judges. They get into sin, then judgment would come, their enemies would come, there'd be a famine or whatever would happen. Then they'd wake up and say, oh, maybe we need God. And they'd cry out to God, and God in His mercy would take care of the problem, whatever it was, in whatever country it was. And then they would serve God for a little bit, and then they'd forget about God again and become indifferent. And the whole cycle would repeat itself. That's what's went on in America if you want to look at history. That's what's went on in all countries when you look at that. But why did they do that? Because they do what individuals do. It's not just countries do that, individuals do that. I tell you, talk with people that, oh man, they're going through a problem, and oh no, what a terrible thing, and they might even show up at church a couple of times. But when the problem dissipates, they're gone. Sometimes people just do that. Why is that? Well, sometimes it's because they're lost. And that's one thing, need to make sure that they know the Lord is Savior. Psalm 10 verse 4, the wicked through the pride of his countenance will not seek after God. God is not in all his thoughts. When people don't even bother to seek God, God is not in their thoughts, and people just go their merry way until that trouble happens. But when it comes, they get concerned. And then trouble seems to pass. Look at verse 4. Now Jeremiah came and went out among the people, for they had not put him into prison. Then Pharaoh's army was come forth out of Egypt, When the Chaldeans that besieged Jerusalem heard tidings of them, they departed from Jerusalem. So the problem has passed away. Does trouble pass? Yeah. Trouble passes. Does that mean there's not another trouble yet to come? No. Trouble happens. And trouble, you go through one trouble and you may get through that, and then eventually you'll face another trouble. That's just life. That's just life. There is this temporary reprieve, and they're breathing this sigh of relief. But it's temporary. That's just plain human nature. People will go through that. When they go to that point, the trouble's gone, they relax and they don't realize that. But that's not the end of what's going to happen. Look at verse 6. Then came the word of the Lord unto the prophet Jeremiah, saying, Thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel, Thus shalt ye say to the king of Judah that sent you unto me to inquire of me, Behold, Pharaoh's army, which is come forth to help you, shall return to Egypt into their own land. See, they made another error there. They relied on man rather than God. They thought, well, the Egyptians are coming. Now, were the Egyptians godly people? No. Neither were the Chaldeans. Verse 8, And the Chaldeans shall come again and fight against this city, and take it and burn it with fire. That was going to go away. And people go back to their old ways when the trouble passes. But you know, there needs to be a change in heart. Isaiah 55, verse 6 and 7 says, that seek ye the Lord while he may be found. Call upon him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake his way, and the unrighteous man his thoughts, and let him return, O Lord, and he will have mercy on him to our God, and he will abundantly pardon. When people earnestly, what people need is an honest repentance, a change, turning around, going the other direction. Many times people don't do that when they simply go to God when there's a problem. There's not a change. It's just a temporary worrying about the problem. How many remember when the kids or the grandkids would do something wrong? I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. Are they sorry for what they did? Uh-huh. They're sorry they got caught. They're sorry they're about to get in trouble. They're sorry this is going to happen, that they're going to get a spanking. They're sorry that they're going to get their electronics taken away. They're sorry that this is going to happen. They're sorry for the consequence rather than for the sin. And that's very much the way that happens, but that's just human nature. Adults do the same thing too, and that's exactly what they did. They were coming back, and they were not to be deceived that this was not going to happen. Matter of fact, God says if you just beat down unto wounded men, they're still going to beat you in verse 10. Wouldn't be too long before they'd be back. What can we pull out? Don't seek God temporarily. Don't be indifferent to God except when a problem comes. Rather, we ought to be attentive to God all the time. Trouble is going to come again. Job 14 verse 1, understand what this man's been through when he says this. Man is born of a woman is a few days and full of trouble. He's lost everything. He's lost his children. He's lost all of his wealth. And his wife has just told him to curse God and die. I kind of wonder, maybe Mrs. Job seen him go through enough and just hated to see him go through it. But in any event, I mean, he went through a lot. We're going to be facing a problem coming up. We may be facing one now. We may not be facing one now, but we will face one in the future. And it's not enough to just rely on God in the problems. We've got to rely on God all the time. Psalm 9:9. The Lord will be a refuge for the oppressed, a refuge in times of trouble. But we don't just run to God when we have trouble. We go to God all the time. And by the way, kind of put this the opposite direction there. When it seems like we have no way to deal with the trouble, and it seems like God maybe isn't listening, God's still in control. Hebrews chapter 13. Let your conversation be without covetousness, and be content with such things as you have. For he has said, I will never leave thee, nor forsake thee. So that we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper, and I will not fear what man shall do unto me. Sometimes bad things happen. Sometimes bad things happen that are done by bad people. We don't blame God for that. God's still in control. And sometimes God can use that. Don't blame God for what man does to us either. We're about to come to that in Jeremiah's life. So sometimes people only care temporarily. Sometimes people don't care about others. Sometimes people are indifferent to others. Go over to verse 12. An interesting thing happens. Now understand, as we look at this, Jeremiah is about to go out and receive an inheritance. Now he's a Levite. He's part of the priestly caste. He has an inheritance where he's going, and but people don't care. Verse 12. But Jeremiah went forth out of Jerusalem, going to the land of Benjamin, to separate himself thence in the midst of the people. He along with others goes over to Anathoth. That's his destination. Now that was one of the cities for the priests laid out in Joshua chapter 21. It was also a city of refuge. By the Bible, he had an inheritance there. He was going there. He was entitled to a share if there was any supplies, if there was grain, if there was things there that he could. He was entitled to that. But when he goes to do that, a very different thing happens. He's falsely accused. Verse 13, when he was in the gate of Benjamin, a captain of the ward was there, whose name was Arijah, the son of Shemaiah, the son of Hananiah, and he took Jeremiah the prophet, saying, Thou fallest away to the Chaldeans. Did he do that? No. He didn't do that at all. Matter of fact, God had told him previously to go redeem that inheritance. He's following what God has told him to say. And when we look at this here, he's falsely accused, and by the law, he had that right to go there. And Jeremiah defends himself. Verse 14, then said Jeremiah, It is false, I fall not away to the Chaldeans. But he hearkened not to him, so Arijah took Jeremiah and brought him to princes. They don't like what he's been saying. We've seen that. They don't like what he's been saying for years. They're mad at him. They want to get away. And this gives them an excuse to do it. And I'll tell you what. There's a lot of people in this world that don't care about others. They only care about their power. They only care about what they have. They don't care about others. And that's what we see here with this. So what do? Wherefore the princes were wroth with Jeremiah and smote him. Yeah, sometimes we skim past that. That means they beat him. Anybody want to be beaten? Anybody want to have a club taken to them and hit with it? That doesn't sound too pleasant, does it? They not only throw him in jail, they beat him before they put him in there. They don't have a care for what he said, for what God has said, for his person. They don't care about him. They smote him and put him in prison in the house of Jonathan the scribe, for they made that the prison. When Jeremiah was entered in the dungeon, in the cabins, and Jeremiah had remained there many days. From what what we see later on, probably what they're doing, each house had a cistern. Anybody ever seen a cistern? I remember one house that I rented back in college. We had a water problem going into the basement. And what it wound up being, nobody realized. There was a big old cistern that was outside there that hadn't been used in, 60, 70 years. But it would collect water, and that would go, later on he's thrown into another dungeon. But they were using those things as prisons. When they went dry, they'd throw a person down into that. And basically the idea was just let him die. That's what they do to him. Now that doesn't really care, does it? We ought to have a heart for people. And these men did not care for Jeremiah, and they didn't care for God's message either, because that's what they're rejecting. So when we look at that, sometimes people do not care about others and are indifferent toward others. Sometimes people only care part way too. Look at verse 17. Now, I'll give Zedekiah this. At least he does a little bit of good here. Zedekiah is at least complacent in what happens if you look at Jeremiah 32. For Zedekiah, king of Judah, had shut him up, saying, Wherefore dost thou prophesy and say, Thus saith the Lord, Behold, I will give this city in the hand of the king of Babylon, and shall take it. He's at least complacent to it. But he just kind of secretly does stuff. Yeah, if you got to do the right thing sneakily, it's not the right thing. You're not doing the right thing in the right way. Verse 17, Then Zedekiah the king sent and took him out, and the king asked him secretly in his house and said, Is there any word from the Lord? Have you changed your mind? Has God changed his mind, Jeremiah? That's what he's asking. He only cares if it's what he wants to hear. And Jeremiah said, There is, for saith he, Thou shalt be delivered in the hand of the king of Babylon. Same word, same thing. And Jeremiah asks what he's done. Verse 28, Moreover, Jeremiah said unto King Zedekiah, What have I offended against thee, or against thy servants, or against this people, that thou hast put, ye have put me in prison? Where are all those prophets that told you this wasn't going to happen, that Babylon wasn't going to happen? They're kind of wrong, aren't they? And one of them was dead. Where are those prophets? Where are those? Do you not understand what God is saying? Was Jeremiah right? Yeah, he was. Sometimes people only care partway. Sometimes people think that doing things halfway is enough. And that's exactly what he does. Look at verse 20. Therefore, hear now, I pray thee, O my lord the king, let my supplication, I pray thee, be accepted before thee, that thou cause me not to return to the house of Jonathan the scribe, lest I die there. He knows what's going to happen. Then Zedekiah the king commanded they should commit Jeremiah to the court of the prison. They should give him daily a piece of bread out of the baker's street until all the bread in the city were spent. Thus Jeremiah remained in the court of prison. What would have been the right thing for them to do? Release him. Now, I'll say this. At least they gave him bread. At least they did that much. I'll give him that much. But he only cares part way. Caring part way is not enough. But there are some that just don't care. Go to chapter 38. Have you ever noticed sometimes things get worse before they get better? The king cares part way, but there are others who just don't care. They don't care for the message of God. They don't care for the man of God. They don't care for any of it. They're angry because it's not what they want to hear. Then Shephatiah, the son of Mattan, and Gedaliah, the son of Pashur, and Jukal, the son of Shemaiah, and Pashur, the son of all these guys, heard the words that Jeremiah had spoken unto the people, saying, Thus saith the Lord, he that remaineth in this city shall die by the sword, by the famine, and by the pestilence. Was what he's saying true? Yes. But he that goeth forth to the Chaldeans shall live. For he shall have his life for a prey, and shall live. Thus saith the Lord, that this city shall surely be given in the hand of the king of Babylon's army, which shall take it. Therefore the princes said unto the king, We beseech thee, let this man be put to death. For thus he weakeneth the hands of the men of war that remain in the city, and the hands of all the people, in speaking such words unto them. For this man seeketh not the welfare of this people, but the hurt. Did he seek the welfare of the people? Yeah, he did. Are false accusations anything new? No. Sometimes people just they don't like what God has to say. It doesn't make sense to them. Why would God allow our nation to be conquered? Why would this happen? Why would this go on? He doesn't seek the welfare of the people, but the hurt. Go read Lamentations and tell me he doesn't seek the welfare of the people. He's not called the weeping prophet for nothing. What does the king say? Look at verse 5. Then Zedekiah the king said, Behold, he is in your hand, for the king is not he that can do anything against you. Okay, what is Zedekiah? The king. Last I checked, now realize we're in a constitutional monarchy situation around the world today. There's not really many absolute kings, except for that in Washington. Did I just say that out loud? When we look at our world, there's not that kind of monarchy anymore. But a king was absolute. I can't do anything against you. That's a cop-out. That's a cop-out. He's indifferent. So what happens? He's lowered into a dungeon. Look at verse 6. Then took they Jeremiah and cast him in the dungeon, Malchiah the son of Hamelech, that was in the court of the prison. And they let down Jeremiah with cords. And in the dungeon there was no water, but mire. So Jeremiah sunk in the mire. That dungeon, that cistern they're using as a prison, there's no water. There's just mire. How many have been stuck in mud? When we had that water leak out there about 3 weeks ago, it was like the old quicksand they had in the Western movies. I mean, it was just like that. It was so saturated, it was like that. But there's no water for Jeremiah. There's just mud. They have put him down there for one reason only, and that's killing. Now, they don't want to get blood on their hands, so they just stick him down there to starve to death. People sometimes just don't care. All this happens because they are indifferent to the message of God. They are indifferent to Jeremiah, who's the messenger of God. They're indifferent to God. They're indifferent to other people. All they care about is their own sense of power. But you know, there's one little light here. One person that isn't indifferent. One person that cares. When everybody else doesn't care, when the king just brushes it off, when they throw him down in this dungeon, when everything just seems like it is lost, this is why I say Jeremiah did have somebody. Because there's one person, one man, one eunuch, Ebed-Melech, who stands up and cares. Sometimes it takes just one person standing up and caring that changes the whole situation. Look at verse 7. Now when Ebed-Melech the Ethiopian, one of the eunuchs which was in the king's house, you know, when all of Israel doesn't care, it takes a man that is a stranger to Israel that cares. I think that's striking. Heard that they had put Jeremiah in the dungeon. The king then sitting in the gate of Benjamin. Ebed-Melech went forth out of the king's house and spake unto the king, saying, he comes up to be the voice of right and of wrong. The king had several that had given him very bad advice, and listened to them rather than the Lord. Now one lone voice comes forward and advocates. You know, sometimes what it takes is one person standing up and saying, I care. And that's what makes a difference. We need people to stand up, and there's a lot more than one person that cares today. We need people to stand up and say, I care. For people to stand up and say things are wrong. People assume everything is right except saying that something is wrong today. Understand that. People call evil good and good evil today. Right. Now, Isaiah chapter 5 pronounces a curse upon that. Woe unto them that call evil good and good evil, to put darkness for light and light for darkness, to put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. So we need somebody to stand up and say right is right and wrong is wrong. And that in turn helps others to do the right thing. Look at verse 9. My lord the king, these men have done evil. He calls it for what it is. In that they have done to Jeremiah the prophet, whom they have cast into the dungeon, and he is like to die for hunger in the place where he is, for there is no more bread in the city. He's going to die down there. This is wrong. This shouldn't have happened. And you know what that does? That causes the king to grow a backbone. Verse 10. Then the king commanded Ebed-Melech the Ethiopian, saying, take from hence 30 men with thee, and take Jeremiah the prophet out of the dungeon before he die. Okay, time out. Is it going to take 30 men to lift one man out of a dungeon? No. That's protection. Right. The king finally grows a backbone and says, no, go get him. Go take 30 men, go get him. Now things are so bad they don't even have any rope, and they have to put some together. Verse 11, so Ebed-Melech took the men with him and went into the house of the king under the treasury, and took thence old cast clouts and old rotten rags, and let them down by cords into the dungeon to Jeremiah. They have to dig up rags in order to take care of everything. But they do it. They use what they got. There's a whole sermon there. But he takes those rags and he takes that and he goes and he takes care of the situation. And Ebed-Melech the Ethiopian said unto Jeremiah, put now these old cast clouts and rotten rags under thine armholes, under the cords. Jeremiah did so. So they drew Jeremiah up with the cords and took him out of the dungeon. Jeremiah remained in the court of the prison. Somebody cared. You know, I step back and I look at this, and I don't see how people don't see and don't count here. God uses him. Go over to chapter 39. You know, just one person caring can make a huge difference. You know, we can make a difference in somebody's life. There's a lot of people out there that people just don't care about. But when we go out and we befriend them and we make a difference in their life, it's amazing what God can do. And in turn, God takes care of us. Look at verse 15. Now the word of the Lord came unto Jeremiah while he shut up in the court of the prison. All right, what comes to him? The word of the Lord. This is a word from God that is directed at one person. I'd say that's pretty special. I'd say that's something that you look at, that one person gets a message from God. Go and speak unto Ebed-Melech the Ethiopian, saying, Thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel. This man's a stranger. But God cares for him. Behold, I will bring my words upon this city for evil and not for good, and they shall be accomplished in that day before thee. You're going to see exactly what God has said. This hasn't changed what's going to happen to the whole country. But for him, verse 17, but I will deliver thee in that day, saith the Lord. And thou shalt not be given into the hand of men of whom thou art afraid. He wasn't afraid of the king. He's afraid of what's outside. And God sees his heart. For I will surely deliver thee, and thou shalt not fall by the sword, but thy life shall be a prey unto thee. Read these last words together. Because thou hast put thy trust in me, saith the Lord. Be a person that cares. Why? Because we put our trust in him. Our world may be indifferent. Our world may have a bad attitude, but we ought not. We ought to be somebody that cares. And those things that he was afraid of, those things that he feared, God said, don't worry about that. I'm going to take care of you. Because he put his trust in God. Let's not be indifferent. We live in a world that's indifferent with people that are indifferent, that doesn't really care, but there is a God that still can save people today. Just like he changed Ebed-Melech's heart. Yeah. Took him 39 years, but Jeremiah had fruit. Let's go before